On a cold December night in 1776, an army of starving farmers prepared to cross a frozen, deadly river. They had no shoes on their feet, almost no food in their stomachs. Yet they kept marching forward anyway. Across that icy water waited the mightiest empire on earth, with the most feared army and navy alive. Britain ruled a quarter of the known world, commanded thousands of warships, and had never lost a major war. Leading this desperate crossing was a Virginia planter named George Washington, a man many called doomed to fail. He had already lost more battles than he had won, retreating again and again across burning American soil. So how did this struggling general, leading hungry farmers, ever defeat the most powerful empire the world had seen? The answer began years earlier, with taxes, anger, and a king who refused to listen to his own subjects. In 1765, Britain's parliament passed the Stamp Act, taxing newspapers, legal papers, even playing cards across the colonies. Colonists were furious. They had no representatives in London, yet were forced to pay for wars they never chose. By 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers killed 5 colonists in what became the Boston Massacre. 3 years later, angry patriots dumped British tea into Boston Harbor, refusing to pay another unfair tax demand. King George III responded with fury, sending more troops and tightening control over a colony slipping from his grasp. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers marched to seize colonial weapons, and the first shots of revolution were fired. At Lexington and Concord, untrained farmers fought back, creating what history would call the shot heard around the world. 2 months later, colonial fighters held off British veterans for hours at Breed's Hill, near Boston, stunning the empire. Congress knew they needed one commander to unite the colonies, and on July 3, 1775, they chose George Washington. He had no experience commanding a large army, only memories of fighting for the British years before against France. Washington inherited a chaotic mess: thousands of untrained farmers with no uniforms, little food, and almost no real discipline. Across the ocean, Britain controlled the strongest navy on the planet, capable of moving armies anywhere in the world. Britain's army was professionally trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened from decades of fighting wars across the entire globe. Most experts in London believed this rebellion would collapse within months, crushed easily by superior firepower and discipline. But Washington had one crucial advantage. He understood that he didn't need to win, he only needed to survive. In January 1776, Henry Knox dragged captured cannons, nearly 500 miles from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston's frozen hills. Those cannons, mounted above the city, forced the mighty British Army to abandon Boston entirely in March 1776. It was a stunning first victory, but the real war, the brutal war for survival, had barely even begun. On July 4, 1776, the colonies declared independence, but words alone could never defeat the British Empire's armies. That summer, General Howe landed nearly 30,000 British and Hessian troops near New York, the largest invasion force yet. Washington's army was crushed at Long Island, barely escaping total destruction by retreating secretly across the East River at night. City after city fell. New York, then White Plains. As Washington's exhausted army retreated deeper into New Jersey, soldiers deserted by the hundreds, enlistments were expiring, and many believed the entire revolution was about to collapse. Thomas Paine wrote that these were the times that tried men's souls, and Washington knew he had to act. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made a desperate gamble that would either save the revolution or destroy it forever. He led his freezing soldiers across the ice-choked Delaware River, planning a surprise attack the enemy never saw coming. At dawn, his troops stormed Trenton, capturing nearly 2/3 of 1,500 Hessian soldiers, suffering 0 combat deaths. It was a small battle in size, but it saved the revolution and proved that Washington's army could actually win. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating British forces and forcing them into a stunned, hasty retreat. These victories reignited hope across America, but the British Empire was far from finished, and worse battles still waited. In September 1777, British forces defeated Washington at Brandywine, Creek and marched triumphantly into the capital, Philadelphia itself. It seemed like everything was collapsing, but far to the north. A different story was quietly unfolding in New York. British General Burgoyne pushed south from Canada, but found himself trapped, surrounded, and running dangerously low on supplies. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army at Saratoga, a defeat that shocked the British Empire. Saratoga became the turning point of the entire war, and it convinced France to finally join the American cause. France had been secretly funding the rebellion for years, but now it brought ships, soldiers, money, and global legitimacy. Suddenly, a colonial rebellion had transformed into a global war, stretching Britain's resources thin across multiple continents and oceans. Yet that winter, Washington's army faced its darkest hour, freezing and starving at a camp called Valley Forge. Thousands of soldiers had no shoes, no proper clothing, and many died from disease, hunger, and brutal exposure to cold. Yet somehow, Washington held the army together, and a Prussian officer named von Steuben trained them into real soldiers. The ragged farmers who entered Valley Forge starving emerged in spring as a disciplined, professional, dangerous fighting force. By 1778, France officially entered the war, sending fleets and troops that would soon change everything for America. Frustrated in the north, Britain shifted its strategy south, hoping Loyalist support there would finally crush the rebellion. British forces captured Savannah, then Charleston, winning major victories that seemed to prove the Southern strategy was working. But American General Nathaniel Greene used hit-and-run tactics, exhausting British forces without ever winning one decisive battle outright. Slowly, painfully, the British war machine bled resources it could not replace, fighting a war thousands of miles from home. By 1781, British General Cornwallis marched his exhausted army into Virginia, settling at a small town called Yorktown. Washington saw an extraordinary opportunity and quietly marched his combined American and French forces hundreds of miles south. Meanwhile, a French naval fleet sailed up the coast, preparing to seal Cornwallis's only possible escape route by sea. In September 1781, French ships defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, trapping Cornwallis completely. For the first time in the entire war, Britain's mighty navy could not rescue its own trapped army. American and French forces surrounded Yorktown, digging trenches and unleashing relentless cannon fire on the exhausted British defenders. Cornwallis tried desperately to escape across the river at night, but a sudden violent storm destroyed his only chance. With no escape route, no reinforcements, and no hope remaining, Cornwallis finally raised the white flag of surrender. On October 19, 1781, nearly 8,000 British soldiers surrendered. Marching out as their band played a mournful tune. Legend says the British band played "The World Turned Upside Down," a fitting tune for that impossible moment. Yorktown effectively ended major fighting, though smaller skirmishes continued, and peace negotiations slowly began across the Atlantic Ocean. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially ending the war and recognizing American independence. 8 long years of war, sacrifice, and suffering had finally ended in the impossible defeat of the world's strongest empire. Washington could have seized power for himself, as many feared, becoming a king instead of a humble citizen soldier. Instead, in December 1783, he resigned his military command, returning quietly home to his beloved Mount Vernon, Virginia. A farmer had outlasted an empire, not through brute strength, but through patience, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will to endure.